afternoon, everybody. My name is Jodi Sandfort, and I have the great pleasure of being the Dean at the Evans School. Thanks for joining us for the Dean's Forum. We have been doing this program for about 3 years, and it really is because we know that race continues to be a really significant part of health, educational, economic outcomes across the country. We have a lot of different topics we've done in the past, and you can find recordings on our website, thinking about how Washington's grappling with racial reckoning, climate justice, leadership in healthcare, post-COVID, Bidenomics, and asset inequality. So this session today is going to be recorded and be on the lookout for follow-up emails and resources that we're going to provide. But I am just really grateful that we are gathered today to talk about political participation and voting access. Clearly, this is a critically important topic in our country, has always been, but there's been a lot of attention, obviously, around it right now. So before I have our guests introduce themselves, just want to start by, as we always do, acknowledging the land that we are gathered on here in Seattle. Coast Salish people have been in this space for time immemorial. They live, study, and work here. And we acknowledge that the country, in addition to Washington, was really built from land theft and genocide of Indigenous communities and the enslavement and forced labor of Black people. So obviously these acknowledgements are small, but we always try to start that way so that we remember and acknowledge the shared history and the work we're trying to do to address that legacy. So voting is very central, obviously, to the workings of democracy. I'm trained as a political scientist, and so I've always been interested in the ways in which this ritual impacts what's happening. And given the discussions right now in current events, I really wanted to bring together some experts who could share different points of view in the conversation. So you can see our little tags there on the screen, but would love to invite Dr. Vince Hutchings to introduce himself.
Yes, thank you, Dean Sandfort. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm actually in the Eastern time zone for this Zoom event, but hopefully everyone can hear me all right. And I'm just hopefully going to speak with a few slides for maybe 10 minutes or so before turning it over to my collaborators on the panel. I would, let's see, can we get the slides? Or for now, is it just my job to indicate? Okay, yes. So I'm a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, I should have said. This should just take a few minutes to help set the stage for our conversation this afternoon. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, there we go. So whenever I've been called upon to give comments in forums of this sort, I always want to establish some facts at the outset so that we're all on the same page. We can get an impression about our political situation from watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, depending on one's proclivities, or any mainstream outlet, that the country is, oh, our slides went away. Oh, they're back. That our country is consumed by politics. And although there is definitely divisiveness in the political environment, it's easy to overstate the extent to which Americans are actually thinking about politics. So I'll just go through the comments on this slide pretty quickly. The first point is that voters are not terribly knowledgeable about politics. They're not, and that's mostly because they're not that interested in it. It's the impression that I'm trying to give here is not that all of us on the Zoom event here are enlightened and intelligent, and the average American is not. That's not the point. The point is that those of us participating in this event are just more interested in electoral politics. And so it's easy to assume that others are like others in the country are similarly inclined. But there's just decades of literature suggesting that that's not the case. So people just are really often uninformed of basic facts about politics. For example, what's the length of a U.S. senator, the term of office? You'd be surprised how many people know the right answer to that question. Spoiler alert, most people don't know the right answer. So the other kind of thing that's easy to lose sight of is the extent to which people embrace, or what's behind their embrace of, ideological labels like liberal and conservative. Those are meaningful in the sense that they reflect a particular kind of partisan orientation, but they don't really reflect a detailed or deep knowledge of politics, or even a consistent one. The bottom line is that even though many people embrace a label of conservative or liberal, their issue preferences are in fact, frankly, all over the map. There's almost no rhyme or reason to the average person's policy preferences in many instances. Indeed, thinking about what unfolded a while back with, I believe it was a ballot initiative in Kansas regarding the abortion issue, I'm not actually getting partisan here, but I think the point I'm making should be evident to all of us. So Kansas is a Republican state for the most part, and will remain a Republican state in the near future, at least. Yet there was a massive show of support for an effort to keep the access to abortion in that state, even as the very same voters vote for politicians who seek to do the opposite. So voters are they're just not consistent most of the time. All right, so the last bullet point gets to how people typically think about politics when they think of it at all. And that's in group terms, primarily partisan terms, Republican and Democrat, but also underneath that in group terms that are kind of salient for most individuals, and that would be on the bases of race or ethnicity or religion. Those are meaningful ways in which people think about the world and think about politics in ways that certainly a consistent ideology is not. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly mention some work of a colleague of mine in the profession. Her name is Liliana Mason, and she's done work. She's at Georgetown, or excuse me, at Johns Hopkins. And she has looked at attitudes that people have who belong to one political party and how they view individuals who belong to the opposite political party. And increasingly, in a way that was not true even 3-4 decades ago, people look at the out party, so-called out party members, as being really enemies. And it's one thing as opposed to, say, being opponents or adversaries. So it's one thing to seek compromise with your opponent. It's another thing to seek compromise with your enemy. In short, you're less motivated to do that because they are morally deficient on every relevant dimension. At least that's how you perceive them. And okay, so how did that happen? And all of this has implications for how we understand ballot access and participation and voting as well. So how did this happen? Because again, as recently as, say, 30 some odd years ago, there were, in the United States Congress, there were plenty of conservative Democrats and plenty of liberal Republicans. That's essentially no longer true. But in certainly my lifetime and most of our lifetimes on this call, I'm assuming, that was fairly common. So increasingly, there's been a shift, to make a very long story short, between the composition of the two major parties in terms of who is aligned with or identified with the two parties. So increasingly, the Republican Party is disproportionately white, and its supporters are disproportionately Christian and disproportionately identify as conservative. That may seem normal in 2024, but if we all jump into our time machine and go back to the early, or I should say the latter part of the 20th century, we wouldn't find that to the same degree. I'll have a little bit of a slide in a moment to drive that point home. And then for Democrats, it's kind of mostly the opposite. So their party is much more racially and ethnically diverse. It's disproportionately composed of atheists and agnostics and other non-Christians, and disproportionately made up of liberals. Again, that might seem normal today, but it wasn't normal a generation or two ago. Next slide, please. So this slide takes advantage of a data that's born out of the University of Michigan in concert now with Stanford University, but initially just only at the University of Michigan. And it's called the American National Election Study, and it develops or presents information on a measure, a survey measure that's called a feeling thermometer. The details are not important except for the following. The feeling thermometer essentially captures how warm or cold you feel towards some object. In this case, the party to which you belong and the party to which you do not belong. Higher values nearing 100 indicate warmth and favorability, and lower values at or near 0 indicate lack of favorability or coldness. So one thing you can note from this figure, hopefully, and don't confuse the blue and red with the traditional, at least in the current era, Democrat and Republican. Blue just represents the feelings about your own party, and red represents the feelings about the out party. So as recently as 2000, people, when they thought about the out party on average, they just had a neutral, which is to say near 50, a neutral reaction to the out party. But beginning around 2000, and certainly accelerating over the last 2 or 3 presidential administrations, people have started to feel far more animosity towards the out party. Their feelings towards their own party has remained stable going back to the 1980s and actually even further. So that this representation here of what we call affective polarization really captures the kind of current political environment that was one of the points in the previous slide, which is that we no longer see the people who don't belong to our party as just individuals with whom we disagree. We see them as objects of scorn. Next slide, please. So the point of this slide, and I'm getting close to being completed here, is simply to show you, again, using the American National Election Study, just how much the partisan balance has changed over, going back over the last 60 years or so. So in 1960, the vast majority of people identified with the Democratic Party relative to the Republican Party. Largely, this was a function of the so-called Solid South, where, in part because of the politics of the Civil War and its aftermath, the South was aligned pretty homogenously with the Democratic Party, the Southern Democratic version of the Democratic Party. But in the aftermath of the passage of the Civil Rights Movement, and I'll have a little bit to say about the Voting Rights Act in a moment, and I think Dean Sandfort will as well, things began to change, to make a long story short. And so many of those one-time Democratic Southerners, white Southerners, began to drift into the Republican Party. It's more complicated than that, but that's much of what's gone on, such that by 2020, we have a fairly close to even split among the two parties. Okay, and why is that relevant? Well, the stakes are a lot higher when it seems as if there's a much more even balance and a much more likely possibility of one party being victorious versus another. That wasn't the case 2 or 3 generations ago. Next slide, please. I made a comment about the composition of the two parties, and this figure drawn from 2020 ANES drives that point home. So non-Hispanic whites represent about 2/3 of the American adult population, but they're overrepresented, that group, non-Hispanic whites, in the Republican Party. And by the same token, Hispanic Americans, who make up about 18 to 20% of the adult population, are underrepresented, and African Americans, who make up about 13%, are almost non-existent in the Republican Party. In the Democratic Party, on the other hand, whites are underrepresented, and both Hispanics and African Americans, and although not on this slide, Asian Americans and other ethnic non-white groups are disproportionately housed in that party, such that the Democratic Party is only barely a majority non-Hispanic white party, at least as of 2020. By 2024, the next time we do this study, that may actually flip. And for the first time in American history, it may be that one of the two major parties is actually composed primarily of people of color. That is a combustible, mix, because we are now layering historic partisan conflict on top of historic ethnic and racial conflict as well. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background about the current political situation with respect to voter access. I suspect that all of us in this audience already know a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, so I'll keep this brief. And the dean is going to go into a little bit more detail, I think, in any case. But so the Voting Rights Act was, of course, passed in 1965 with the Johnson administration. And among many things it did to help ease access to the ballot, which had been denied to most African Americans after the collapse of Reconstruction in the late 19th century, the Voting Rights Act allowed for basically federal oversight, and in particular, something that's referred to as pre-clearance, wherein covered jurisdictions, all of which, by the way, were not in the South, but most of which were, covered jurisdictions were required to seek this thing called pre-clearance from the Attorney General or from a circuit court before they could institute new voting laws, because new voting laws in these covered jurisdictions were usually basically a means by which to undermine the voting rights of African Americans and other people of color. So the Voting Rights Act cut that out. All right, so fast forward several decades later to the Shelby v. Holder decision, the Supreme Court decision in 2013, and the relevant sections of the Voting Rights Act, sections 4 and 5, were essentially invalidated, at least with regard to pre-clearance. So essentially the court found, or at least a majority of the court found, that the formula by which pre-clearance coverage was determined was outdated, and Congress needed to update that formula in order to reimpose it on the covered the relevant jurisdictions. As we know, of course, Congress is not terribly, how should I put this? They're not as efficient as they may have been in previous eras, and so as a consequence, their ability to arrive at a bipartisan consensus on this has, in the 11 years since the passage of this Supreme Court decision, not come to pass. So this has not happened, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, a major component of the Voting Rights Act is simply null and void. Next slide. And this is my last slide. So what are the implications of all this? Well, in a world in which we have all the things I've described up to now, we have competing visions from the two political parties as to why we need restrictions or not on access to voting in this country. The Democrats, of course, put forth the notion that efforts to curtail access to the ballot are really just ways to undercut their constituencies' ability to vote and thereby undermine their chance to win elections. Republicans, on the other hand, argue that they're trying to maintain and safeguard voter integrity or electoral election integrity, and to go up against voter fraud. The thing that we should be mindful of as we have this discussion moving forward is that in the 21st century, but also in the 20th and 19th centuries, when political parties find it difficult to court or persuade new voters to add them to their coalition, then they're incentivized to vote, to suppress the vote of their opponents. So one thing I didn't say previously is that the various constituencies that are now associated with the Republican Party are declining in growth rate, whereas the constituencies associated with the Democratic Party are growing at the fastest rate. This is particularly true for Latinos and for Asian Americans. So the bind that this gives rise to is an incentive on the part of the Republican Party to potentially discourage voting from their opponents. It's worth noting, by the way, that this same incentive unfolded in an earlier era with the Democratic Party in the 19th and early 20th century. So this is not something that's peculiar to the Republican brand, but it may be particularly relevant in the current era given the composition of the two major parties. Very quickly, I'll end here, is that some work by political scientists Benele and O'Brien has found that the effort to propose and ultimately pass legislation to restrict voter access is highly associated, after taking into account a number of different factors, with Black population size and minority turnout. And why is that? It's very much in keeping with what I've been saying up to now, because we know that African Americans are almost uniformly, almost unanimously aligned with the Democratic Party in the current era. In a previous era, by the way, it would have been the Republican Party. This is what the case was in the aftermath of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments following the Civil War. But following the election of FDR in the 1930s, Blacks have shifted, and especially in the 1960s, to the Democratic Party. So there's it. So I don't pretend to know whether or not these laws are having the effect that they're designed, at least ostensibly, to enact. But there's no doubt that the evidence suggests that the proposal and the passage of these laws are very much associated with the demographics of the state, in particular, the racial demographics of the state. And that probably is a good place to stop. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Vince. As you could garner, Vince is a professor of political science and African-American studies at the University of Michigan. And his expertise is in elections, voting behavior, and public opinion. So for our conversation this afternoon, I've also invited a few other colleagues who play different roles in the system, so we can dig in. But Garth, I'm wondering if you would introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'd love to, and thanks for the invitation to participate. My name is Garth Fell. I'm the Snohomish County Auditor here in Washington State. County auditors are responsible for a number of things. We are responsible for vehicle and vessel licensing, document reporting. In many counties, the auditor will have financial responsibilities. In Snohomish County specifically, we have animal control responsibilities, and then auditors in all counties, with the exception of King County, they're responsible for elections. And in King County, it's the elections director that is responsible for elections. So I've been the elected county auditor in Snohomish County. I'm now working on my fifth year, second term, but I've been administering elections in Washington State for 25 years. I'm a certified elections and registrar through Auburn University and the Association of the National Association of Election Officials, also known as the Election Center. So I've been working in this field for quite a long time, and certainly committed to ensuring that we are doing the best work we can for voters.
Thank you. Calista, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Calista Jahn. I work here at the Evans School, and my title is the Innovation and Engagement Manager. And so what that means is that I work as a project manager and a researcher here at the Evans Policy Innovation Collaborative, or EPIC, which you can also see in my little title. So EPIC is a policy lab, and we primarily use participatory and human-centered design methods to find solutions to pressing societal problems. I'm personally passionate about social policy and civic health policy arenas. And I'm here today because our team recently completed a project where I served as co-investigator from the Secretary of State about understanding rejected mail ballots here in Washington State, and kind of understanding the Washington voter experience.
So the reason why I called these people together is obviously in this current political movement, there's a lot of questions being raised about the integrity of the voting process. And wanted to know a little bit more about that in the kinds of terms that Vince laid out for us. And the history of the Voting Rights Act clearly points to a history and legacy in this country of not wanting to have equal access to voting for all groups of people. And there has been these political things, the lawsuit that Vince talks about in 2021. There was also the John Lewis Act that was trying to restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act. But I guess a question I have, Vince, to you to start is, how did we get here, do you think, to this moment? You just told us a story mainly about demographics. Is that the primary thing? Or are there other things around partisan affiliation that just kind of helps us understand that lying in warmth, or the demonization, I guess, of the other political party? Because that's an important thing that people like Garth have to work in that Callie and I are trying to understand and document here in Washington?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's and I know I went over it kind of quickly, so I'll maybe try to be more coherent this time. It's been gradual. So not even with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the white South did not immediately abandon the Democratic Party. That didn't actually happen until it gradually began to unfold, culminating with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and then accelerating thereafter. So in answer to the question, how did we get to this point? We are currently in an era where all of the various divisions in society, what we would call cleavages in the social sciences, those cleavages or divisions in society, which historically are broken down along lines of race, class, religion, and various other dimensions, they didn't all map onto our partisan divisions in the way that they do at the moment. But they do. The example I'll use is actually from Liliana Mason to drive this home. I thought it was colorful, so maybe it'll work here as well if I don't butcher it. The way she put it was, now the way the politics works in our country is that the winner of the Super Bowl determines the winner of the Stanley Cup and the World Series and the NBA championship, because it's all one thing, because it's all in the stakes are such that if the Republicans lose, it isn't just the Republican Party losing, it's Christians losing, it's white Americans losing, and similarly in the case of the Democratic Party, it isn't just the Democrats losing, because all their supporters are disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities, and also LGBTQ, et cetera, that when the Democrats lose, then these salient social groups also lose. And so consequently, the stakes seem to be higher. When I was coming along, every presidential election wasn't described as the most important election of our lifetime, as we seem to be getting now on a regular basis. So we got here because of the shift of the constituencies of the two parties. That's very different than it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, even in the 90s. Now it's such that it's very similar, without being too alarmist, to what it was in the 1850s and the 1860s.
So Garth, I'm sure in your role as county auditor, that makes you pause and think about how you try to maintain a nonpartisan process for voter engagement in the state of Washington. What do you do in Snohomish County?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first, the expectation that the process be nonpartisan, I think, is accurate, and it's needed. And I think that more and more we are being approached by people that come with an assumption that county auditors are perhaps not acting in a nonpartisan way. And so I can say unequivocally in Washington State, the county auditors are committed to making sure that we maintain a nonpartisan process. The challenge becomes convincing voters and candidates and others that is the case. And what we found is our job has really changed in terms of we still have the administrative aspect of what we do, counting ballots, but we also have this education aspect around really helping voters understand how the process works and providing significant transparency so that they can see that we are following federal, state, local laws and administering the election in a nonpartisan manner. And so it's created a whole new body of work for auditors' offices, and certainly I think my colleagues and I are up for the challenge, but it does present some challenges in terms of resources and other things that we need to do a good job.
What are the things you've been doing that you think is working?
I think one of the things we've recognized is that we can't be the only trusted source of information. We need to be working with community groups and community partners to get information out about elections. And so we have built strong partnerships with the League of Women Voters and other groups in our community to kind of help with that education and engagement piece, and we're really trying to build a network of groups, a diverse network of groups that can speak on our behalf and speak around the various things that we do in elections to make sure that it is a fair, accountable, transparent process. So we are also looking, and certainly have utilized partnerships with the University of Washington and other groups to do research that we may not be well versed in conducting on our own, or simply may not have the time to do as well. So those partnerships, I think, are really the kind of the cornerstone of what we're doing to try to bridge this gap between understanding and confidence for voters.
So, Callie, you mentioned that you were a co-investigator on a study. What did you learn about Washington voter implementation here?
Yeah, so to kind of set the stage for where our report came from is the Washington State Auditor conducted a study on rejected mailed ballots in Washington, and found that there may be potential kind of systemic issues with ballot verification. And by ballot verification, I mean the processing and verifying a voter's signature on their ballot envelope, which is always checked in the process to make sure that it matches a voter record before the ballot inside is tabulated. Our study continued to look at that and see whether there were these sort of systemic variations. But we also looked at just generally, how do our state's voters experience this vote by mail process? How do they experience returning their ballot, and how do they experience the curing process when there is an issue with a ballot envelope? And then we also looked at what are common or best practices that we can further to help support our voters' efforts to cure their ballot. So we did find that there is a small amount of variation. So about 1.5% of all primary ballots cast and 1.1% of all general elections ballots cast were rejected across elections from 2012 to 2022. So that's about 30,000 ballots in every election are being rejected. About half of these rejected ballots are because a ballot is returned late. So that points to really key efforts being needed in educating voters about getting your ballot in on time, making sure that it is in the ballot box before 8 p.m. on election night, or postmarked on election day as well. 0.5 to 0.6% are rejected for missing a signature or having a signature that doesn't match what is on file. So that points to ideas around educating voters to make sure that they sign their envelope, and that they sign their envelope with intention of meaning knowing what they are signing and hoping that it matches what is on file with the voter record. In most cases, what is on file with the voter record is what's at the Department of Licensing, because here in Washington State, we have motor voter, which is great. And in our interviews with voters and as part of our study, we conducted interviews with voters who had their ballot rejected in the November 22 election. So we interviewed 18 voters who had had their ballot rejected. And a lot of these voters indicated that they did know that their ballot was challenged due to a mismatched signature. So they were aware of what had happened, that they did know that their ballot was challenged. But few were aware that that signature was most likely matched to what was on the Department of Licensing record, or the record of when they registered to vote. So they say that they don't tend to have one standard signature. What is on the driver's license might be quite different from how they sign something every day. I have a quote here from a voter about this exact theme, which is that it didn't match what I have on my driver's license, which is back from when I was 16, and I didn't know what my signature would be, so I just wrote my name down. Or another one that I got married and I changed my name, and I don't sign my name very often, and so I don't really have a signature for my new last name, and so I think whenever I sign it, I just kind of sign it without having an established signature in my mind. Now, definitely things with signing a ballot happens. We might sign something incorrectly, or you spill juice all over it, and there's a challenge and you get contacted. So then we also asked voters about their experience with the ballot cure process. most voters, the same as that they trust our Washington election systems, and they indicated that in their interviews, also say that they found the cure process relatively easy, but some may choose to cure for a variety of reasons. They received the notification after Election Day, and so the results had already been published. They didn't see a need to cure their ballot. Voters were too busy, or they found the process too much of a hassle to go and stick something in the mail again. Voters intended to cure it, but forgot. There's so much going on in our lives. Are we really going to respond to another government message? Or that the process might have been confusing. And so a great quote here is, I think the process as a whole makes sense. But I did get kind of confused about what that cure letter was for. So I don't remember if it said, like, I don't know. It just looked very serious, and it kind of spooked me for a second. I didn't know what was going on. So I guess that would be my only complaint. But besides that, it was pretty straightforward.
So none of this sounds like, well, quite frankly, it doesn't sound very sexy, right? It doesn't sound like there's a major social movement to make certain groups of people kept out of the voting process. It sounds like it's administrative. It sounds like it's this kind of disconnect between how the system is set up and how people understand the system set up. Garth, is that kind of the conclusion of you and your colleagues?
I mean, I think it points to some effort needing to be spent on continuing to educate on the process. I think the initial report from the auditor's office also identified that there was some variation based on race and perhaps language differences. And so I think from that standpoint, auditors are always looking to improve. We have kind of dug into that element and tried to figure out how can we better educate our staff to be a little bit more culturally competent when dealing with voters from different backgrounds. And also looking at implicit bias and training staff on those concerns as well, just for awareness. And I think we've seen some benefits from that. But yeah, I think there continues to be a large element of this, just, kind of issues are due to mechanics and not understanding the mechanics of an election and how an election runs. So I think both are areas we need to continue to work.
Vince, is there a dynamic that's different between the states that have mail-in ballots and those do not? And do you know off the top of your head how many states are like Washington that does the mail-in ballot?
Ooh, that's a great question. I do not know off the top of my head. Although my impression is that this would be more frequently the case for Midwestern and Western states. But I'm
Garth, do you know?
Not sure.
It's approximately 5 to 6 states right now. Oregon was the first vote-by-mail state. Colorado does kind of a vote-by-mail flavor. California is now mailing ballots to every voter, as well as allowing them to come to polling places. And I think Utah is more and more a vote-by-mail state. It is a Western phenomenon.
And so why is it a Western phenomenon, Garth? Do you know?
I think historically, Western states have maybe innovated a little bit sooner than Eastern states, but that'll probably draw some comments from anybody that's from the East Coast. But yeah, we've seen innovation in the elections administration field, kind of driven by Western states more so than maybe the traditions of those Eastern states.
Vince, do you know much, or Callie, do you know much about the way that mechanism of implementation affects turnout or engagement?
I do not.
I think that some studies have kind of preliminarily shown that mail-in systems do increase voter turnout, mostly based on a convenience perspective. Because when something is mailed to your door and you just fill it out and you can send it in, you're not waiting in line to kind of get in the door somewhere. And I think that in our full report, we have some references for that we can send out to the group.
Yeah, because one of the questions in the chat is asking this question about when you're going to local polls and mail-in ballots. And obviously when you're big geographies or remote areas that mail-in ballots might be helpful, but I'd be curious to see the implications of it overall. So, again, part of what I'm really struck by is that this conversation so far has been very different than what we hear in current events, where it seems very charged, it seems very much about control and influence, and it's very racialized because of the history, and that's not the story so much that I'm hearing. So I'm curious about that.
Well, it depends on which story I suppose we're telling. There certainly the implications for race are not. That's one of the things I tried to drive home. It's because there is such a overlap between race and racial identity and classification and partisanship in the current era. Partisan conflict inevitably takes on a racial character. It's even in the absence of animosity or at least narrowly defined bigotry or prejudice, every political party wants to win. And if the opposing party's supporters are also racially distinctive, then that's an incentive to try to diminish their access, even if it's not born out of racial prejudice. Now, that's a fine distinction and not very comforting to the people who were potentially being denied access. But I'm only chiming in to make the case that race is not too far from the front burner here for reasons that are inevitable. Inevitable not because of some natural racial animosity. Indeed, the classification of race itself is not natural. It's just a social construction, but it's inevitable because of the way in which it is aligned with party.
So there's the macro context of that multi-decade shift that you talk about. And then there's the on-the-ground reality of the way that states carry out the elections and then the mechanics of that. We have a couple of questions from one of the people wanting to know more from you, Callie, about that trend line on rejected ballots. Has that been pretty consistent over time? And, what did you learn about the mechanics of the signature verification and the cure process? And what are the recommendations about how to address that in Washington?
Yeah, so I'll start with the kind of trend over time by saying that we looked at rates from between 2012 and 2022, so about a decade's worth of data, and that kind of correlates to the implementation of our vote loss system here in Washington. And that is kind of like the Secretary of State's data management system for voting data. And overall, generally, no, the rates stay pretty consistent or fluctuate for very small margins up and down. And that reflects the fact that we have a really great system here in Washington, right? We're talking about 30,000 or so ballots per election that are being rejected. And about 60% of ballots that are challenged are being cured by our processes. So we have a really great, secure, and safe and trustworthy election system going. The one caveat I would give is that the 2020 election that we had was a pretty significant one for many a reason across the nation. And that one had a much lower ballot rejection rate overall because most people got their ballot in on time. There was a lot of external advertising and outreach and education about that election, empowering people and really telling people when to get their ballot in so that their voice could be heard. And so with that election, it had a much lower rejection rate than many of the others that we looked at. And I don't have the number in front of me, but that's definitely something that we can send out with the resources later. And then in terms of the second question, which was around kind of the mechanics of it, I think that one of the areas here that I think is really key is ensuring that all of our state's elections offices have the resources that they need to do their job to the best of their ability. And so for some of our offices, that meant that they do not actually have access yet to all of the technology that they would like to be able to best process the ballots that come in the door in a timely and efficient manner. Many of our larger offices use a big piece of equipment called a sorter to help them process the tens or hundreds of thousands of ballots coming in the door. And not every county that wants one of these big machines has one yet. So if our state could provide the resources to allow our county offices to have the resources like that they would need, that could help that along. And then the other
Can I just ask Garth? Garth, do you buy what Kelly's saying about the resource stuff?
Yeah, I think resources are certainly a challenge. In Snohomish County, we process 450,000 ballots in a presidential election that come back. And we're fortunate to have sorting equipment to help with that. It helps capture the signature and helps with the signature verification process. It can also lend to potential future use of technology to get technology to do some signature comparisons. But most over half of our counties in Washington State have offices where there are 3 or 4 people in the entire auditor's office doing all of those functions of the auditor's office with a small facility. They're really under-resourced in terms of their ability to do some of the kind of efficiency pieces that we're able to do in a larger county. So I do agree with that. I'd also point out that we historically see in presidential election years, fewer people return their ballots too late. There's a significant drop in that number. There seems to be a motivation to get the ballot in on time. And so, I mean, I think there's some human nature that works its way into this as well. And then certainly in 2020, there was the concerns about the post office, which was a narrative that really motivated people to get their ballot back in early. So just a little more context there.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in also and say that there are other innovations happening, right? There are text message pilots occurring here in King County. There is the potential, like Garth mentioned, to use technology to kind of do a pre-pass on signature verification, and to take a look at that in the future with research will also be important to ensure that we're not furthering any inequities in the system by launching things that we might see as creative, awesome solutions right now.
And Kelly, just how prevalent are those? Do you know the pilots and the kind of hyperlocal pilots?
Can you explain what you mean by prevalent?
Just how frequent are they, or are they mainly concentrated in urban areas, or just as you've talked to people in Garth's role over the state, or maybe Garth,
First of all, it's hard for us to do pilots in live elections because of the rules and laws around elections. Our work is very prescribed, and so launching new technology to compare a signature or utilizing something different than a signature comparison really isn't supported under the law until recently. This last legislative session, there was a bill passed that allows for some pilots of the signature verification process. And so we're excited to see what that work looks like. I know King County has done some work on the cure process and utilizing technology to allow people to send in a cure electronically or text a cure is something that's been done in other states. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's prevalent that counties are all being innovative. I think some of that is, again, limited based on the rules we need to follow. And then some of it is certainly limited based on the resources and time and energy it takes to pilot something new.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that's come in is about the Get Out the Vote activities in 2020 and election education and engagement efforts for 2024. I'll just say, I know here at the University of Washington, we are doing an 8-part series highlighting experts like Vince from our campus who are involved in different things related to voting, misinformation, disinformation for all of the students at the University of Washington's 3 campuses. Because we know, at least for our students, we want them to make sure that they can navigate through all the mixed messages and things that are coming at people about the integrity of the system and the process overall. But I'm curious if any of you know of other specific ways that are happening either in Washington or around the country to really help people be a little bit more informed and be able to cut through all the noise.
Yeah, there are some things done that are being done at the federal level. There's a Trusted Info 2024 hashtag that's been designated for use by federal agencies to kind of share and tag information that people can trust. There's a lot of work being done at the county levels to make sure that their outreach and education materials are informing voters about process as much as it is about deadlines. So I think the one thing in a presidential year we've historically seen is that motivating people to vote isn't the concern. It's people are going to show up. It is really helping them understand the process that they're going to have to go through. And now in our current day, helping them understand that they can have trust in the process because they understand how it works. We also certainly encourage anybody to come down and observe the elections process. All of the county ballot counting operations are open for public observation. Several counties have live stream cameras that allow you to watch the process as well. That can create some potential security concerns for others. So that's a challenge we now face in our world too, is just the threats against election officials and needing to balance safety with access and transparency.
Are you or your colleagues experiencing that in Washington State, a feeling of threat for your workers?
We certainly are, unfortunately. There have been, over the last 2 elections, there have been incidences of mail being sent to election officials with white powder in those envelopes. And in most cases, it was determined to be fentanyl that was being sent to elections offices. So there's an ongoing investigation on that threat that hit several of the counties here in Washington State and other counties in other states as well. And then just in the kind of polarized environment we work in now, just the concern that if an individual's candidate loses, somebody may respond inappropriately to that result, and that's unfortunate. We try to continue to maintain the message that the elections administration process is nonpartisan. We're concerned about the process, not necessarily outcomes, and so that's our focus.
So Vince, you've beamed in from Michigan, but you have a national perspective on this. I'm curious about how what you've heard mirrors what you think is happening in other parts of the country. There's also a question here that you might want to jump in on about ways that private philanthropy can support civic and electoral processes, or ways that you've seen where public and the private sectors can work together to help make sure that elections go well and appropriately, and both address historical biases, but also kind of confusion right now in voters' minds.
Yeah, those are both good questions. I mean, so there are, in terms of issues concerning, say, security for election workers, that, of course, it's a concern here in Michigan because we're a swing state, as well as just being an issue throughout much of the country. Presumably, this ramps up in the immediate run-up to and immediate aftermath of elections. So we are still several months out from the presidential contest. In terms of private public kind of partnerships and how best to facilitate turnout, I mean, that's a tough one, and it's harder for me to provide an answer on that. I mean, I think it's true, as Garth was saying earlier, that when it comes to presidential contests, there's a lot. This is something that, to the extent that people are going to be motivated to vote at all, this is the contest for which they are going to be most motivated. Turnout is highest, not surprisingly, on presidential contests than for mayoral or gubernatorial or Senate or congressional elections. But even granting that, there's still a large fraction of people, even in 2020, which was the highest presidential turnout in like a century, there were still millions and millions of Americans who didn't vote. So what I'm trying to give voice to here is that we haven't yet cracked the nut as to how we can get better turnout, barring mandatory turnout, which some countries actually do have. But in the absence of that, it's not at all obvious how to increase our turnout.
What's your opinion about mandatory turnout?
I believe places like Australia and some other places around the world do this. It seems a little coercive from the American point of view, and so I think people might resist it, given the history of this country and how it came about, et cetera. But the penalties are not. It's not. They don't throw people in jail if you don't vote. There's just a minor fine, as I understand it. So I don't actually have a big problem with it. I think it's something that we should be thinking about, along with ranked choice voting and some other non-traditional solutions to encourage turnout, in part because, and of course, the context in which this discussion is unfolding here is largely about the impending presidential contest, but which is going to be competitive, whatever else we can say about that contest. But for many elections around the country, they're not competitive. And because they're not competitive, there's not much of an incentive for people to turn out, given the first past the post voting systems we have, where you just need to get a plurality. And so my point is that if we can think about ways to shift, or at least consider possibly ranked choice voting or other kinds of mechanisms, it might encourage turnout if people thought that they could have a say in a way that our uncompetitive elections sometimes discourage turnout.
So I just looked up and I realized we are almost at the top of the hour. Just curious if any of you have any final comments or ways to kind of summarize the key points. Callie, I saw you have some directions in the chat to people in Washington what they should do. Garth, Callie, Vince, final words.
Yeah, I would just say that, if people have concerns about what's going on with elections, reach out to your county auditor. Your county auditor is going to be the person that can tell you the rules they're following, can show you the process that they're following. They should be open and transparent. That's how it's the only way we're going to convince people that this is a system that they should trust, and they can trust it. I'll be very clear there. But yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to your local county elections official, the auditor, or the elections director, and make sure you understand the process. And then certainly participate. Elections are decided mostly by the people that don't show up, right? And rather than any of the issues that we have with administering elections.
Agreed. I'll just quickly add that I would urge people to check out the websites of their local election jurisdictions to find more about the process if they're at all concerned. You will be surprised the level of detail and security that's embedded across the country in these processes. It would be exceedingly difficult for someone with nefarious intent to engage in voter fraud at a massive scale, even if they were so inclined.
Yeah. Just to kind of echo that, but also just to kind of say, if folks, aren't feeling that trust in the government right now, let's make sure that we continue to send resources to the root where Garth mentioned, to our community-based organizations that are the ones that really have the key access to groups that are likely to have low voter turnout or less likely to respond to a cure notice in the mail, so that we can help solidify those partnerships for our government. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody, for taking the time, and hope this is helpful. And we will be sharing additional resources with people who registered. And thanks so much.